Awesome. Okay. So, Dr. Josh, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for everybody? Because I feel like that'd be helpful. I'm always talking about you to people at the same time. Sometimes I'm like, I'm sure there's so many things I'm unaware of. So, if you would
Yeah.
introduce yourself, that would be awesome.
Yep. My name is Dr. Josh Matson. I own Infinity Functional Neurology Center in Des Moines, Iowa. We focus specifically on working with kids doing neurological rehab for kids that either have like traumatic brain injuries, cerebral palsy, ADHD, autism, learning disabilities are a big one. I actually had my own issues with learning disabilities when I was younger, and so that kind of triggered a lot of kids that have learning disabilities was our main thing. Now we're getting a lot more to traumatic brain injuries and anoxic brain injuries and kids that can't move, can't speak, can't talk, or can't do any of that type of stuff. And that's kind of been our practice. It's kind of gone that way. And but yeah, that's what we do, and it's so much fun. It's a blast. We work a lot with primitive reflexes. We work a lot with rehabbing their kids' balance centers, eye tracking centers. We have we call her a learning therapist, but she does a lot of like cognitive based stuff for kids that have learning issues. Um, and just simply put, we help kids develop from zero to wherever they're at. And a lot of kids missed a lot of stages along the way, and so we work to redevelop through those different systems. So
Awesome. So, I don't know if part of my story was that my son had gone through some of this, and we were even talking the other day. I was like, I think we should make a checkup to Iowa just to like have him evaluate, because it was really, we had gone through so many different avenues for him, and we couldn't figure out, like, no, would have been almost 12 years ago, and it was a several year journey where I kept saying something is not right, something is wrong, like what is happening. Probably about 2-3 months something started shifting, and it really was an eye doctor who caught it because he has amblyopia. And so he was like, okay, well, when the vision isn't tracking and we have no convergence, we have no depth perception. So we did some vision therapy. So that's how I had learned initially about retained reflexes and all that, because they had kind of started checking, kind of walking him through some of those different kind of integrations. But
yeah, working like
and
the 18R and STNR, those types of things
yeah,
for that. Yeah.
yeah. But to go back before I jump into that, because I have some questions beyond that, because I feel like I've talked with so many people from the vision world on kind of that
Yep.
idea, but from a neurology perspective, I would assume it looks different, or you have a different perspective of it. So before I jump there, my question for you would be, how did you kind of get into neurology? And the way I was introduced to you, right, was like, oh, this is a functional neurologist. So how does that
Yep.
different than typical neurologists? And what are some things that you either work with, from both sides, if you kind of break down both sides of neurology?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm first and foremost a chiropractor. That's what I went to school for. That's what my base training is in. And then I did my postgraduate studies to get my certification in functional neurology. I did that through the Interdisciplinary Association of Functional Neurology and Rehabilitation. That can be done by any doctor. So it can be done by a DC, it can be done by a DO, MD, PT, eye doctors can do it. So the group is a great group. And if you ever need resources or finding a provider or stuff like that, just like, an eye doctor that does vision therapy and stuff like that, there's some really good ones. They teach some of those seminars over ocular issues and whatnot. But the great part of it is it allows all of these different disciplines of doctors to have a good understanding of the function of neurology, what's supposed to happen, and allows, hopefully that network gets big enough that we can talk on the same level and we can understand things in a similar fashion. So that's functionality in a short there. And I actually got into it because one of my best friends in chiropractic school, he was becoming a functional neurologist during school, and he did an exam with my wife, and it was the most eye-opening thing I had ever seen. It was really, really cool. And so then that's when I started learning about functionality, and then I got into pediatric neurodevelopment. And I just saw the need. And then looking back, I had a lot of struggles when I was younger, like I couldn't read to save my life. I mean, it was a really big struggle. And come to find out, I had a lot of retained primitive reflexes. I had convergence issues or the inability for my eyes to work appropriately together, for them to track appropriately. And my thought process was, if I can help a kid to not have to go through those struggles, that's a big value added to the world. So, but the difference between functional neurology and neurology is we're looking at functional networks in the brain. So we're looking to see how well are those networks connected. Can we improve the connectivity to improve function? Traditional neurology is looking at, you have these symptoms, let's do an MRI. Do you have a brain tumor? Do you have a lesion? Do you have a structural issue going on that's causing that issue? If not, it's kind of out of their wheelhouse, to be honest. But functional neurology takes into the perspective of, if you get a Lyme infection, if you get, an infection that creates PANS, PANDAS, and all that neural inflammation happens, what networks get disconnected, what's going on there? And not only working with someone, like Emily, to get that neural inflammation down, but then retraining those networks so they get strong again. I end up seeing a lot of kids with like PANS or PANDAS that they've done all this stuff to get rid of the infection. They're doing good there, but neurologically, they're still not appropriate. And it's because those networks need retrained a lot of times. So that's kind of a simple breakdown of funk neuro versus just normal neurology.
Yeah. I have so many questions. My brain is like ping ponging. So, so hopefully I can, get the ping pong under control. And you're probably sitting there going, here's what's wrong with your brain when you're ping ponging.
No, you're good. It's normal.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, and this is my understanding of kind of some of that neurodevelopment, is that there are functional reasons why children end up in the state of, during that incredible pivotal moments of our brains developing, whether that be in the womb, and then moving forward the first couple of years of life, when there's things present, then those connections are not made. So we have to go in and retrain. Do you think that it's possible for someone to not kind of do the therapies that you do and still see success? Or is it kind of like we'll get stuck because our brain hasn't experienced kind of that development yet?
I often say, and maybe this is answering your question, maybe not. I often say this to my patients because I truly believe it's true. 90 to 95% of any issue that comes into my office, I don't care if it's bedwetting, autism, eye tracking issues, it resulted from a dysfunction that didn't develop really in the first year of life. And, when we go back and we look at primitive reflexes and how they affect normal maturation of the brain, and then all the systems that build off of those reflexes, like your eye tracking systems and your balance systems and your cognitive centers, there's really we have a normal progression of development. And when you start doing a really thorough history for those kids that are really struggling, they miss something along the way. Maybe they didn't roll appropriately. Maybe they didn't army crawl. A lot of kids don't army crawl, which plays into their reading later in life and their eye development. A lot of them don't crawl on time. They should crawl right around like 6 to 8 months. A lot of kids don't hit that time frame, and they should walk right around 12 months. A lot of kids walk really early, which a lot of people think, oh, that's my kid's advanced, but really that's a lack of appropriate development of their asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. Or if they walk really late, around like 14, 15 months, that's also a sign of lack of development. So there's typically always signs that there's abnormal development going on. But maybe their pediatrician didn't even know that was a thing, didn't even know to talk to them about it because they don't quite understand the normal neurological progression. And those things, when I do an exam on a kid, it's almost always that they miss something along the way. And if we can kind of go back and work to retrain a lot of those systems and get rid of primitive reflexes and get their eyes more stable and get their balance centers more developed, they progress so nicely and so quickly. And especially if they're, they don't have all those underlying infections and, food sensitivities and all that type of stuff is kind of taken care of or looked at. That helps tremendously as well, because those environmental factors stop your brain from maturing and developing appropriately.
Yeah. And that was definitely my son's case, right? Like he did not, I think he rolled over at like 9 months and walked at 10 months. So
Yeah.
a question within that would be, what do you do, or what would you recommend? So a lot of patients that I have or clients that I work with, they're so outside of the scope of modern medicine that a lot of them don't even have a pediatrician that they're necessarily going to, unless they live in a location where they have some really good, like, functional type,
Yeah.
pediatricians. Um, and so I would say a lot of times they ask me those questions from a developmental perspective. What would you say or recommend if you're seeing those kind of signs? Let's say the child is walking and they shouldn't be walking yet.
Yeah.
I had this thought the other day. I was like, I don't know. Do you like push them back down and say, no, you have
Yeah.
to like crawl? Like, do you like get on the ground and make them crawl? Like, I was just curious that if you catch it within those stages,
Yep.
what would you do, or what would you
Yep.
recommend?
So the easiest thing to do is I made a short course. It's at limitlessfoundation.co. It's a really short course. I'm not even barely charging anything for it, but it's the normal neurological progression that should happen in the first year of life. What should happen from 0 to 3? What should happen from 3 to 6? When should they be hitting these motor milestones? If they're not, what are reasons for it? Like, what, maybe this reflex isn't developing appropriately, maybe this other one isn't developing appropriately. And that will help them understand like that normal progression of what should be happening while their baby's developing, to save them a heck of a lot of issues later in life. Because, in your case, if you would have known, hey, my kid should be rolling over right around 4 to 5 months, and he isn't, what are things that I can do to start fostering that progression? Or he's not army crawling at 5-6 months, what can I do to start facilitating that? Those are really helpful just to save issues in the future. When it comes to like a 10-month-old starting to walk, I work a lot on their primitive reflexes, and like that, a lot of times they start to walk because maybe a parent gives them one of those little mowers that they can maintain their balance and push around. I always tell them, don't give them that, make them move. And it's once you get rid of their reflexes, like their asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, their crawling is much easier and they'll do it a lot more. But yeah, I try to not let kids walk until 12 months because they need to crawl, and crawling helps you build both sides of your brain together, helps you develop your limbic system so you don't have any emotional issues later in life. And if you don't crawl, you're going to have reading issues. Like there's a lot of, I see it in every kid, like that comes in with severe reading issues, they all skip crawling. There's lots of research behind that, and it has to do with their asymmetrical tonic neck reflex not developing, which plays into their ocular development of the eye tracking issues. So yeah, crawling is super important. If it was my kid and they were trying to walk at 10 months, I would push them back down, to be honest.
Yeah.
And teach him to crawl, physically get on the ground and put him through that motor crawling pattern, work on getting rid of some of those reflexes and make sure that happens.
Love that. You remind me where you said that course, you can find that course.
It's limitlessfoundation.co. And I'm working on a few different new courses for parents as well, for like primitive reflexes and stuff. But there's a few different courses on there that I've made over the last, year or so.
Awesome. I'm going to throw that in the chat just because I think that can be helpful for those. And if there's anybody on who has a question specifically, I have a couple of questions that came through yesterday, but any questions, feel free to type it or unmute yourself if there's something that Dr. Josh is saying that you have questions over. Awesome. Okay. That's super great. So I threw that in there, and then I will add that to some of the other notes because I think that's super helpful, because that's where I feel like we're at this place in history where I think the best advocate, right, is going to be the parent. Like I don't feel like you have, in some of the struggle with even like social media, is that you have so much information and then you get people who are just fearful and stuck, and they're like, I don't know, I don't even know where to go anymore or what to do. And that can be so problematic because these parents get stuck in like I'm so afraid of everything that I can't send my kid to school. I can't send them. We can't go. I had a client that wouldn't go on vacation, because she was just so fearful there was going to be molds there or EMFs there that she couldn't control. And so that idea that like kind of the goal is, what do we want for our children? If we want them to thrive and be able to function in society to the best of, what God gave them, then we have to be able to have those tools to be able to weigh that off. And I think that so much of medicine or cognitive thinking in parents is going back to really basic things, saying, who cares about all these, big, crazy tools and, even methylation and genetics and all that stuff. That's great. And that plays into a role. But if you don't have the foundations and the basics,
Yeah.
if they didn't crawl, then,
Yeah.
maybe all the Lyme protocols isn't going to do as much if you really need those neurological connections to be made.
Right. And, if you think about it from like an immunological standpoint, a lot of these reflexes help to develop your brain stem and your lower brain centers, and they fire up and start to develop your cortex, especially in that first couple years of life. The right side of your brain is developing at a higher rate than your left. Well, if you don't develop your motor milestones appropriately, right side of your brain doesn't develop as efficiently, left side starts getting stronger. What happens is when your left side of your brain is firing at a higher rate than your right, is you have your immune system has a higher reactivity to different foods, to different infections, all that type of stuff. So you get this imbalance, and this is what you see with kids that have PANS, PANDAS, that type of stuff. Is their right brain is weak, their left brain is overactive, and their immune system is overactive. So when they come across a mold, or they come across a XYZ, they're going to have a higher response to that. And so a lot of those immune issues are really issues of dysregulation of the brain. And these reflexes, they develop your brainstem, which out of that, your vagus nerve comes out. Vagus nerve is super important for your immune system. And there's certain reflexes, like a motor reflex, it plays into that more than other ones. But if those don't develop, appropriately, those systems don't develop appropriately, and therefore you're going to have worse immune system issues or dysregulation of that system. So doing finding out all those things, like, oh, I'm, maybe more susceptible to having issues with mold, or I have these underlying infections. It helps a ton to get, work on getting rid of those. But at the same time, looking back of why did it develop in the first place, or why was my brain not strong enough to control my immune system appropriately to, not have that excessive response in the first place.
Yeah. So I've been doing some diving into more of like that kind of, C generation, where just like with technology and different things, right, where like kids are kind of like hunched over, and there's a lot of things I've been listening to or reading papers and stuff, right, about like how and I'm going to butcher this and not say it correctly, but how that has so much effect on left brain, like the left brain being stronger, and we're not really getting that right brain activated. Yep. Because of the way technology is, and the way that even from a structural perspective, you're hunched over. So as a chiropractor, do you feel like
Yep.
is that part of what you would say from a treatment perspective? Do you do a lot of correction in terms of structure?
Yeah, I adjust every kid when they come in before I do. Like, for example, let me put it this way. So a lot of times I look at brain imbalances. Let's say the right side of the brain is weaker, left side stronger. In relation to, you see that a lot in like ADHD, you see that a lot in autism. So from a chiropractic perspective, I'm only going to adjust them on the left side of their body, because that activates their left cerebellum, fires over, activates the right side of their brain. When their brain starts firing more efficiently, their own brain comes in and shuts down these reflexes. If I were to go to the other side and adjust on the opposite side, the reflexes would get worse instantly. So it becomes really important to look at those brain asymmetries in relation to, from a chiropractic perspective. And some of the courses on that website are for chiropractors to teach them that. Cool. But yes, posture wise, your postural muscles are hugely fire into your brain. I mean, it's one of the biggest inputs into your brain to help it to develop. And if a kid, let's say they're 5-6 years old, they're supposed to be moving at least 4 hours a day minimum. And if they're sitting on an iPad in a poor position, number one, straining their brain, releasing way too much dopamine, which also activates the left side of your brain, ruining their attentional networks, and then not moving, you're just setting that kid up for a complete disaster in their development.
Yeah. That was one of our biggest reasons we pulled our kids from public school, was because at kindergarten, they each had their own iPads. And crazy. I was like, this feels like a really bad, like we're already working against, especially with my son. And then my daughter ended up with PANDAS later in between kindergarten and first. And so it was like, this is the thing we try to avoid. And now we're going to school for 6 hours. You're doing all of your work. And it's only going to get worse as they got older,
I know, it's crazy.
Melinda had asked in the chat, when babies don't crawl, is there a reason that they skip crawling?
Yeah.
From a root cause perspective, or, anything you see toxin wise in the environment?
Yep. The number one reason is that child will still have what's called an asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. It should go away at 6 months of life. If it doesn't, you can't create a cross crawl pattern. Therefore, they won't crawl. Most common reason I see that not develop, a lot of times it has to do with traumatic birth. They have injury to their upper neck, therefore they can't move their head through full ranges of motion, and that reflex actually develops through full ranges of motion. So if you see like an infant, let me scoot my chair back, prior to 6 months, what should happen is when they're laying in their bed and their head's turned this way, this arm will straighten and this arm will flex, and same with their leg on the same side. That's called a fencer position, but that's really them using this reflex to develop their brain. So their head turns, their arm extends, they're learning to do extension of this arm, flexion of this arm, they're connecting their hands and their eyes together. So that reflex should be there to help you to develop all that range of motion. Well, if a kid can't move their head, they can't develop that reflex appropriately. Therefore, they don't get enough stimulation for their brain to shut the reflex down. And so then when they go to crawl, they need to be able to turn their head and extend their arm. Well, what you're going to see is they turn their head and their arm drops out. So if you put that child on their hands and knees, drop their low back down and turn their head, you'll start seeing that arm drop out on the opposite side. That's almost always, 99% of the time, that reflex doesn't develop in kids that don't crawl.
Yeah.
I have a question really quick. Sorry.
Yeah,
you're good.
It's Lexi. What do you see like when kids are really delayed in walking? Like my daughter didn't walk till like 16, 17 months.
Yep. ATNR will typically be present because, let me just stand up. Okay, so let's say I turn my head this way, everything on this side of my body wants to flex, this side wants to extend. So it throws them off balance whenever they move their eyes or if they move their head. So your eyes, your neck muscles, your balance centers, they're all connected. So when your eyes move, that can even throw them off. So if you've seen like, so that plays a lot in the walking skill, but also as they get a little bit older, kids are like playing soccer and they're on the ground more than they're upright. It's typically because they have an asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. That's a very common reason. There's also another one called a moral reflex, which is a startle reflex. So if you've moved, like you have an infant that's under 3 or 4 months, and you kind of move them quickly, or you make a loud sound around them, their arms come out, that's a startle reflex. And a lot of times that doesn't go away, but that one's really important for the development of your vestibular system, your balance centers. And then another aspect of that is if they toe walk after they, learn to walk, sometimes they'll still have a Babinski reflex in the bottom of their foot, and that plays into not being able to walk appropriately. So usually those 3 reflexes are related to lack of development of those motor skills and especially those balance centers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
To go back real quick, crawling, walking, you had mentioned, like traumatic birth and that type of thing, that can, be affected. Do you see that? I think Zooms won't kick me off if I use the V word. But like with that type of trauma, whether it be environmental trauma or illness, do you see that play a role too? Or would you say it's more structurally from like that traumatic birth and those type of things?
So let me think how to explain this. When you see a lack of hitting your motor development, that is known as that should be known, or really is known as a neurodevelopmental delay, or a delay in normal neurological development that's resulting in delay in motor development or movement development. There's lots of things that can play into a lack of that development. Like kids are born with like 200 and some toxins in the placenta and stuff like that. Those all affect neurological development. Any stress from a medication, a toxic stress, that can affect that neurological development. So yeah, those things definitely can, and other kids more than other ones. Like if they have MTHFR, they're probably gonna have a worse immune system response to it. The biggest thing to look at is, and I find this to be true, is I read this book. It's called Vaccines and Autoimmunity, and it's like a textbook. It's a guide for providers to know, hey, when is it more safe or less safe to give a vaccination to a kid? And the biggest indicator that they found in there was if there's a family history of autoimmunity, like your grandma has rheumatoid arthritis, your grandpa has irritable bowel or celiacs, they're a lot more likely to have an excessive immune system reactivity, creating more inflammation. Therefore, the brain isn't going to be able to function appropriately. So anything that alters normal neurological development, whether that's a mold toxicity, a food sensitivity, those are really common. A virus, a medication, a whatever that your immune system responds abnormally to, that's going to alter normal development. And especially like a lot of kids fall off stuff at a young age and get a concussion and hit their head, and those things play into it too.
Yeah, that was another question I had was, do you see it revert back? I think I've seen adults who, get stricken with brain concussion or extreme illness or injury or whatever. And then all of a sudden it almost appears to me like those reflexes came back. It was like,
Yeah.
You're a little jumpy.
Those are called return reflexes. So what happens is we always have these reflexes. Lifelong, we have these reflexes, but our brain gets strong enough to inhibit them or shut them down. So when you see the reflexes being there present longer than they should be, it's simply because that child's brain can't function efficiently enough to shut the reflex down. So if I were to go get a concussion, God forbid, what you would see is my reflexes would come back. And they come back because they're survival reflexes. So they come back to try to re-stimulate and try to regrow my brain. So if they're there, it's simply because your own brain is trying to stimulate itself to get that growth to happen. So they're really beneficial. But when you see them, it simply means the brain is not functioning well and able to actually shut them down. And then they become roadblocks in the way of more complex movements, more complex skills, and it requires your higher brain centers to have to do kind of like overtime to get them to shut them down or to adapt to those.
Yeah. Do you feel like you ever see children nowadays, or even adults for that matter, who come to see you, who you evaluate and they don't have them? Like they're still having issues, but they don't have any reflexes present?
It's usually like let's say I see a kid that has, a lot of stuff going on. The mom goes, "Hey, I want you to check my other kid. They don't have anything going on. I just want to make sure that they're doing okay." That's about the only time I really see them not being present in some extent or another one. There's a lot of reflexes. I check probably like the 8 most common ones. And if a kid comes in with an issue, there's gonna be reflexes.
Okay.
Unless they're like, the only example I would say is like I saw a 16-year-old girl that had a concussion. I only found like one primitive reflex, but it was related to her vestibular system and her eye tracking centers. And so like as they get older and the brain matures, a lot of times you'll see that they may not have them as much or as many of them. But if it's a younger child and they have issues, those reflexes will be present. And once you get rid of the reflexes, it's pretty much night and day difference in how their behaviors are, how their emotions are. And it's really, really quite fascinating.
Yeah. How do you see it hold? So like if a child has done work in your office, even if they still have a lot of like Lyme and mold and, parasites and they're living in environments that aren't healthy, right? So you still have like the emotional trauma or whatever. Do you tend to see like, oh, we do, I believe you do a lot of intensives. And so they come and they do the work with you. Do you then tend to see it hold even as they continue to work through?
Yes, typically I do, unless they have a big trauma, they get a concussion. Food sensitivities are something that'll bring them back a lot though. Like, let's say we do a food sensitivity test and a kid has, a gluten issue or dairy issue or whatever. And we don't take it out long enough to get their gut to heal and do the appropriate support there and get their gut healed. When they reintroduce that, sometimes you can see that reflex start to come back, but that's a good indicator to know, hey, my child's gut still isn't healed well enough to be able to handle that, response, and it's still affecting the brain. So you can use these reflexes as a guide to know, oh, is my, care of their digestive system, did that improve their primitive reflexes? Because a lot of times we'll take gluten out or dairy out or whatever they're sensitive to, and the reflexes will dramatically improve, if not go away. And then I know, hey, if we reintroduce that in 6 months or whatever, and those reflexes start coming back, that child still can't handle that. And maybe it's maybe they have celiacs, maybe they have,
Mhm.
genetically they have predispositions that have issues with that forever, or maybe it's just they couldn't digest it appropriately, it created too much inflammation, and
Mhm.
once they got their gut healed, then they're fine with it. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I've seen kids just go through crazy parasite cleanses and all of a sudden dairy doesn't
yeah,
bother them anymore, so
yeah,
for
yeah,
sure, there's all
exactly.
sorts of reasons why, but that is interesting and also a good point to always point back to, because sometimes I think we have this idea that we do the work and then we should never have to do it again.
Yeah,
And so curious with what you do, if that also would be similar, like I would tell people, like, if you clean up the environment, but then you go back to McDonald's, like it's probably going to come back because it's still not something we
yeah,
should be putting in, being
yeah.
proactive in it. But
Environmental factors are more important than, if I can stress anything, environmental factors are more important for brain development and normal development than anything. Like we have foods that are extremely toxic that we're eating. We have water that has horrible stuff in it if you're not drinking filtered water.
right.
EMF, all of those different underlying infections, like those things, they're really important for proper brain function. And we can get really good changes, even if those things aren't being addressed, but the changes are night and day different when they are addressed.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and as you get your brain more mature and functioning more appropriately, your immune system does better and you regulate yourself more appropriately to a lot of those other things as well. But again, a child's brain or a human's brain, just in general, was not designed to handle that amount of stress and that much environmental stress. And that's why we're seeing so many developmental issues. They just changed the CDC just changed the milestone recommendations because so many kids weren't hitting appropriate milestones. Like,
So we just change it.
yeah, let's just change it. It's been the same way for the last however many
Oh,
years, whatever. But all of a sudden now they can't, kids no longer, need to crawl and they no longer need to walk at 18 months. And it's okay if they don't talk till 2, but those are all signs that kid is delayed. And
yeah.
and I understand why they did it, but it's honestly they're ridiculous when you understand the proper development.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it lets us sit in where we're at instead of asking the questions to fix the problem. We just change the standard. So then all of a sudden you're normal,
Yeah,
like then autism becomes normal and everyone has it. And
yeah, exactly. Yep, and that's the route. I think is we're on the route of 1 in 3 kids have autism by 2030 or something like that, which is crazy.
Yeah. And I feel like that was predicted, a decade ago, and it's still like we're right on track.
Yep,
I don't know how much we've shifted. Melinda had a question as to how long do you usually work with the child before you see changes?
Depends what they come in for. Like it also depends how underdeveloped that child is and how underdeveloped that nervous system is. I would say on average, like if we were to do an intensive, let's say not a child with autism, not a child with super severe ADHD, not a child with a severe traumatic brain injury, maybe a child that has some learning disabilities or has some eye tracking issues or balance issues or behavioral issues. If we do a week-long intensive, typically we can get rid of those reflexes in a week. If you're local, I don't do intensives as much. I usually get rid of those in about 6 weeks. If they're autistic or they have severe ADHD or they've had traumatic brain injury, sometimes it takes me 2 or 3 intensives. And those are like week-long intensives to get rid of those reflexes. Once you get rid of the reflexes, that's really when you start seeing a big change. And you stimulate the brain appropriately, you start seeing big changes. But if you're hitting the right systems, like I always expect changes quickly. And if I'm not getting them, it's simply because I'm missing something. Like, maybe I missed that we didn't do a food sensitivity. Maybe I didn't do an organic acids test and they're not producing energy efficiently and I missed that. But if the brain has 3 things, if it has nutrients and can utilize it, and has glucose, it's not creating inflammation, it has oxygen, and we're stimulating it appropriately, those neurons should connect and we should create neuroplasticity and get better function. And if that's not happening, it's simply because I missed something that I shouldn't have probably.
Yeah. Would you walk us through a little bit when someone would come for an intensive? Because again, most of who I work with, right, would not be local to Iowa.
Yep.
What does that look like for clients who come see you?
Yeah, yep. So a lot of times I'll do an online consult first. If you haven't worked with someone like Emily and done some of those testing, I may recommend some different tests based off of my experience with neurology and stuff. And then we run some tests to figure out some stuff. Maybe I change nutritional protocols, or I change some different supplements or things like that for a little bit prior to coming. So that way we make sure we are getting nutrients, we're getting oxygen, child's not anemic. So that way when you come, I can make as big a change as possible, as fast as possible. Then when you come for a week, depending on the age and stuff, typically I'll work with the kid for 2 hours every day. Sometimes I'll do a week, sometimes I'll do 2 weeks, depending on, if it's a really severe case, I'll do 2 weeks to start. And then we work through that normal progression. We work through getting rid of primitive reflexes first, because developmentally they should develop first. Then we work through developing their balance centers. Then we work through developing their eye tracking centers. And then we work on cognitive stuff. But it depends on the underdevelopment or what that status is. Some kids, over a year time period, I might do 6 intensives. Other kids, I might do 2 intensives. And some I just do 1 intensive and they do really good. And 6 months later, they're doing great. And so then I don't have to do another one. So it's really kind of depends on, number one, what I find in their initial exam when they come in and how they progress through care. It depends on what I'm going to do after that. So everyone's still different, even though it's an intensive, but it's 2 hours a day. And then if it's like an anoxic brain injury, or it looks like maybe they're not having good oxygen saturation, I'll put them in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber prior to me doing therapy with them, so we can get them more oxygen.
Most of what you do then, because I know I've seen some of your videos and stuff, and it looks like you use some lasers. You're doing, like you said, adjustments. Most of it hands-on. Are there other technologies outside of kind of lasers or hyperbarics that you're using?
Yeah, so when we do an assessment, what we typically will find is one side of the brain is weaker than the other one, right? So I'm going to do a bunch of sensory stimulus to activate the opposite side of your brain. So a form of that would be an adjustment. Adjustment is we move the musculature really quickly, fast stretches the muscles, that activates the opposite side of your brain. Maybe we'll use different colors. Like, let's say we're talking about a right brain delay, blues, greens, stuff like that. Those, we have what are called eye lights. They flash blues into your left visual field to activate the right side of your brain. We might use a bunch of vibration. We have something called a Neurosage, which is a video game platform that allows us to do specific auditory, visual, and vibratory stimulation to one side of the brain or the other one. So we'll use a lot of that. I'll do vagal nerve stimulation, trigeminal nerve stimulation, which helps push blood flow to the brain. Tons of low-level light therapy, or what's called laser light therapy. That works great for let's say I find that the right cortex is weak, left cerebellum is weak. I can use lasers over both those areas while we're activating it with different activities. So that's called basically we activate the neuron, and I'm using light to get more energy production at the same time, so those neurons can connect quicker. So we do that a lot. We use a lot of different therapies, but it really depends on what area of the brain's affected, what's going on. And we do a lot of other movement strategies for kids that maybe they have cerebral palsy, or maybe they have had an anoxic brain injury and they have a lot of contraction. We'll do some different movement stuff to get them to be able to start opening their hands and movement and start getting that range of motion back.
Yeah. And then do you send parents home with exercises or things to work on?
Yeah, I send them home with a pretty in-depth protocol at home, because nothing happens with neurology. It's consistency over time.
Yep.
And also intensity. So I intensely work with them. And way I kind of explained it is I try to get the stream built, and I want them to go home, and I want them to keep making that bigger and bigger and bigger. So eventually it turns into a river, and we don't need a whole bunch of water or stimulus to keep that river flowing. Like the Mississippi, it's going to keep flowing even if it doesn't rain for a very long time. So the goal is to get those pathways developed and strong, or at least get them developed with an intensive. And then when they go home, they're going to keep stimulating those pathways over and over and over again until I can see them again. And that way we make sure that we're always progressing and not getting stagnant.
Yeah. For a parent who might not be able to come to see you outside of your courses and other things? Anything else that you would encourage them to do, whether that be maybe there's a network that they can find people like you. I don't know if there's a network like that. They can see if there's someone more local to them. Otherwise, how would you encourage them to go about fixing some of these things, right? Because sometimes we like see it and we're like, oh my word, this is my child. But then it feels fearful because we may be, hours away or not have the finances or whatever.
Yep. Well, number one, I'm recording next week. I'm going to do all the videos for it, but I'm going to have an online course for parents to kind of work through all the stuff, or options to work with us, or even just to work with me one-on-one on developmental stuff from home. So I'm hoping to get that up by the end of January. That's number one. Number two, iAfter is a good spot. There's different iafter.org. They have all the providers listed on there. A thing I would say to note on that is the great majority of them aren't specifically pediatrics and not so in depth with pediatrics. So that does play into stuff because they look at, when you're working with an adult, you look at them completely different than with a kid. But from a perspective of looking at normal development, we see a lot of parents and kids that come to us and they're doing PT, they're doing OT, and they're just simply not progressing. And it's usually because they're not approaching it from a normal neurological perspective. So if your kid still has primitive reflexes, the therapist shouldn't be working on their balance centers, their eye tracking centers, because they don't even have the foundation for that. So number one, I'd say find someone that knows about primitive reflexes, whether that's typically it's an OT, and have them work on those like crazy. And get those reflexes developed is the most important thing. And I often say, always remember that if your kid's diet is trash, like they're not going to improve. If they have food sensitivities, they're probably not going to improve them. And it makes life way harder. So always check for food sensitivities, always make sure their diet's clean, not a ton of staying away from those bad omega-6 oils, and, just having a clean paleo type of diet, a whole food diet. If it comes in a box, it's not food. So making sure that's clean, but make sure you're looking at it progressively. So primitive reflexes, after that's gone, then you can work on their balance centers. After that's developed, then you can work on their eyes. And if you work through that progression, they'll progress as long as they have enough energy.
I love that. And then you mentioned some of those courses. Is there a way that people can be on a newsletter or something? How would they see when that is? How would you let people know that's available?
Let me email. Let me see here. I gotta make sure I give you the correct email. I don't want to mess up here. Email Caitlin at iowainfinity.com. That's KAITLYN at IOWAINFINITY.com. Once that's up, because I have someone working on our website for that right now. And she does a lot of our marketing and stuff like that. She can put you on a list. That way I can shoot that out when it comes out. And that'll have a couple different programs, and one that would work well for you guys is the first base one is just going to be looking at neurological development. So if they've already done a lot of the functional med type of work with you guys, then you don't need to do the rest of it, but it's going to teach them how to do a developmental exam, and then how to, what exercises to do based off of that, what stimulus to do based off of that. The second level will be incorporating some different functional medicine stuff and working with my nurses. And then the last level would be working with me specifically. So the first level would probably work really well for them since they're already working with you.
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, perfect. I will email her too. That way I can let people know when it's out. If you have just I think we had one more question.
Yeah, you're good.
I just want to be respectful of your time. So you just let me know if I lose time. Jenna had asked if her daughter's going to a chiropractor who's not focused on reflexes, is it detrimental? I think because you had mentioned if the right side versus left side and stimulating, doing an adjustment on both sides.
If that child has primitive reflexes, it definitely doesn't help get rid of them. Let's put it that way. But just in general, adjustments improve spinal mobility, which improves range of motion, which helps get rid of those reflexes. They go away a lot faster if you're doing one-sided adjustments based off of brain asymmetries. So I wouldn't, there's no way I could know for sure unless it was like, unless I saw them, because then I would know we make an adjustment, the reflexes go away. We adjust on the other side, they come back. Like that's how I test to see what side that I need to be on and that type of stuff. So kind of hard for me to tell for sure. And you'd have to have primitive reflexes to know for sure.
Yeah, awesome. And I think Melinda had asked the question, but Melinda, I think he had already answered this, but I'll go ahead and anything she can do at home for her 8-month-old who's walking while she tries to find someone in her areas who is knowledgeable. And I think you had mentioned some of the courses, and I think I had written down one of your courses, you talked about developmental, and you kind of talked about maybe forcing them, like getting on the floor with them and helping them crawl and that type of thing.
Yeah, that child will have an asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. No doubt in my mind. There's some different exercises to work on that, but at 8 months old, it's as simple as what you're gonna find is his neck is really tight. So like you'll straighten his arm on this side and his leg on the same side and turn his head in the opposite direction. And at first what'll happen is you'll try to turn his head and it's like doesn't move. And as you keep going, you go, it gets looser, and it gets looser, and it gets looser. And then the more and more you do it, it'll get looser and looser and looser. And then you do the opposite side, it'll get looser. During it, he will cry because he doesn't like his head being touched when you have an ATNR. It doesn't hurt though. As soon as you stop, he'll stop crying. That's how you know things don't hurt with kids. Is it's more of like an abnormal perceptual thing. But the when you stop and they stop crying, nothing hurt them. And and working on that reflex won't hurt them either. But you have to work through that like 5, 6, 7 times a day to get their neck to move appropriately. Then they can start developing that reflex. Then they can start crawling. But yeah, you want to make sure that they are crawling because or else later in life you're gonna have reading issues. It's so common. Yeah, that's awesome. I think those were all of my questions. And I don't see any other ones in the chat. Any last parting words that you have? Any amounts of more wisdom you want to give us? Let's see. I would say if you know anyone that has an infant or is going to be having an infant, like my mission with making that like really short infant like program, it's not very expensive. It's simply so that I don't have to work on a kid that has a reading issue that shouldn't have a reading issue if they would have known that information. And it's so simple and it's so basic. So if you know anyone, just send that to them or just mention something to them about it and making sure that's developing appropriately. Because, if I can just save a kid the struggles that I had to go through, or lots of these kids have to go through that could have been resolved by the age of 6 weeks old or 3 months old, like life it will be so much better for them. So that's what I would say is check that out or send it to your friends that are having kids or whatever, just so we can start reversing this epidemic of developmental issues and not, just ignoring it.
Yeah, I love that. Even as you said that, I was thinking I have a friend who every time she holds her baby, he only looks to the left. And I was like trying to even snap at my fingers and he will not turn to the right. And I was like, I think you might want to have that checked out.
Because he can't
turn. Yeah. And I mean, he's like 4 or 5 months old. So it's not like he should be able to.
What you'll see in that kid as he starts crawling is he'll probably drag a leg because he's only developed the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex on one side and not the other side.
Yeah. Oh,
so he'll start
good.
dragging leg, or he'll that have an abnormal crawling pattern, which creates abnormal brain development. So
yeah. And this is like, I see this in parents, and there's nothing against parents who, have to work full time, but like so often when kids are at a daycare center all day long from morning till night, and then they, jump in a car seat and then they're running because Big Brother, whatever, has all these sporting events, like they're not really on the floor for parents to observe that. And so I feel like that's a good reminder too, for those whose kids are gone all the time. Like we need to be more attentive when they are at home to see what we're doing. Cause that's not necessarily the caregiver may not recognize that.
That third child syndrome.
Yeah.
Just
running all over.
Yeah, and honestly, to develop a lot of those reflexes when the kid's, a few weeks old, a few months old, whatever it is, it takes almost no time. Like you could invest 3 minutes a day and it'll help develop, those systems because they're so young and their brain's so plastic. And it's as simple as just getting them to start changing, and then brain just takes over. Like it doesn't take long. Like you could do 10 really short sessions of working on that reflex, and it literally takes you 15 seconds to do. Like it's not hard. So, but that course will help teach them why and how.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. So appreciate
You're
your
welcome.
time. And I feel like it's so helpful because I know that I can read the test, I can do all the supplements, but like at some point I'm like, I know there's more on hands body work that, I can't help with. So I appreciate knowing and being able to like send people your way and just being able to understand more of what you do and just all the wisdom. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And as you put this out, if people have questions, like more than happy, if you make a list of questions, I can just run through and do a video and answer them for them and send it back to you or something like that. So just let me know.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
You have an awesome rest of the day, and we will talk soon.
Sounds good. Enjoy the holidays.
Right. You too. All right.
All right.
Bye.
See you guys.